All right, everybody. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to do this webinar. It has been one that we've been looking forward to for a very long time as we get this measure out to more people to be able to use to screen for kids who might be at risk for commercial sexual exploitation. So I'm going to start us off with just discussing a little bit about current information regarding CSEC, or commercial sexual exploitation of children, just so you have a little bit of a background in case you're not quite familiar with all of that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the projects that we have done with the child advocacy centers over the last couple of years to get this questionnaire ready and out there. And then for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about the actual questionnaire, what it looks like, how to use it, and what our expectations are for organizations that want to partner with us. Okay, so here we go. All right, so to begin, just to think about commercial sexual exploitation and what that actually means, I have a definition up here from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And I guess some of you might just be calling in and may not actually be able to see the presentation, so I'm going to read this off for you. So basically the definition is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, advertising, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. And what they consider a commercial sex act is any sex act on account of which anything of value is given or received by any person. And so that's kind of a somewhat broad definition, but one that for the most part, I think most states adhere to. I know Arkansas, for the longest time, this idea of force, fraud, or coercion also mattered for minors. So if minors were engaging in commercial sex acts, that they had to have proof that there's force, fraud, or coercion. But nowadays, the definition and the legality of it is that if they are under the age of 18, that actually does not matter. They should be considered a victim of commercial sex act and not charged for prostitution and that kind of thing. So just a understanding of what that looks like for what we're talking about today. I wanted to mention just a couple other things that Arkansas has done over the past couple of years. So they've passed a few different acts in an effort to better address the problem, better identify the problem, better understand the problem, to help victims. So one of the acts extended the definition of child maltreatment and now does include human trafficking. So you can actually call into the child abuse hotline and report this as its own separate child abuse act, and they track that differently now. There's also things with, there's a thing that's called the Human Trafficking Victim Support Fund, and if I can get this correctly, basically what that is when a vehicle has been impounded, the costs of that, so if the vehicle was part of commercial sex exploitation, the funding from that or the money from that vehicle being impounded actually goes into a support fund for victims. How that's being used to date, I still don't know. If anybody else knows, please let me know, but that is something that was passed. And then another thing that was passed in Arkansas is that any Class A commercial driver's license holders have to complete a human trafficking prevention course so that they're better able to recognize as they are out doing their job, because we know a lot of times that trafficking happens within truck stops and that kind of thing. So it's important to know about that too. So there's some different things that Arkansas has been doing, which is promising. We are hoping to contribute to some of this and to continue to help with legislation as we continue to identify kids in Arkansas who are at risk or have been exploited. So that's kind of why I wanted to go over that. I want to talk a little bit now about common risk factors for CSEC. So this is important because this is basically where we got our understanding and our ability to screen for risk, because we're looking at these different risk factors. So it's important for you guys to understand these a little bit better. Because when you look at our questionnaire, you might kind of think like, well, what does that have to do with trafficking and how does that assess for risk and that kind of thing? Well, it's because we're looking at these risk factors and things that might put a child, make a child more vulnerable for being exploited. So one main thing is family dynamics. It's important to pay attention to. So these are things like Chaotic families, domestic violence, poverty, or history of exploitation within the family. This is important because this kind of chaotic lifestyle within the family can lead to other things. So it could lead to some of these other risk factors, such as a youth running away from home or a youth engaging in substance use to kind of self-medicate or any of that kind of stuff. It can also potentially lead to child maltreatment. So we know just difficulty within the family is something that we want to be looking at. And then history of exploitation in the family, this is definitely can be an intergenerational thing that's going on. And so it could be where the mom or the dad has been involved in trafficking somehow, some way, and then they get the kids involved. I've seen that in my own practice before. And so that's something to just pay attention to. So family dynamics, definitely one risk factor. Another risk factor, child maltreatment, again, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect. We see that a lot with kids who have been exploited, again, because it puts them, that makes them more vulnerable, puts them at risk because they're engaged in other types of activities as a result. Risky sexual behavior is another risk factor. So if a child has had multiple, or an adolescent has had multiple sexual partners, if they're engaged in risky sexual behavior such as unprotected sex and that kind of thing, if they present with a history of multiple sexually transmitted infections, that's another kind of red flag that something might be going on, and that they're not just necessarily engaged in just risky sexual behavior, but there might be something more to it, or they might actually be being exploited. And then involvement with law enforcement is a big thing. So that could be for any type of reason. So running away is a big risk factor in and of itself, but that also leads to kids being picked up by law enforcement. It could also lead to, or other things that they might be getting picked up for, so stealing, shoplifting, trespassing somewhere. Say they ran away and they have nowhere to stay for the night, so they trespass somewhere so that they can have a place to sleep. Illegal substances that they might be using. So all of these things put them more at risk. So if they're going to a lot of different parties, these are places where traffickers or recruiters might be hanging out. Or if they get picked up and they're in the juvenile detention centers, sometimes other kids in there are in there specifically for recruitment purposes. Or if they go to residential treatment because of some of these behaviors, there's also kids in there that are there for recruitment as well. So just all of these different risk factors are just that. They put the kid at risk. They make them more vulnerable to experiencing CSEC because just where they're at, or just how they are. They're more vulnerable. They're in more vulnerable situations. They're in places where traffickers and recruiters are typically at. So this is what we are looking at, paying attention to as we are attempting to develop something, a measure that does look at kids who might be at risk. Another thing to pay attention to is pathways into CSEC. So these risk factors, make kids more vulnerable, put them at risk, but what are the pathways that lead to being exploited? Definitely one process is youth who are kidnapped. That's something I think that we are a little bit more aware of, where kids may not necessarily be in all of these different risky situations, but they are just kind of taken from where they're at, off the street, walking home from school, or different things of that nature. That's one way. Another way is youth who run away from home, or homeless youth. Within about 48 hours of being homeless or running away, the majority of these youth are often solicited for sexual acts. So they're much more vulnerable. Youth are also solicited on social media. I think this is the most common way now. So about 76% of youth are solicited on social media for exploitation, for sexual exploitation, or for just trafficking in general. And then again, as I mentioned before, youth exploited by their family members. It's definitely something that can happen within the home. So just a bunch of different things to pay attention to, again, as you're working with these youth or screening for CSEC. So now I want to talk a little bit about our projects that we have done that got us to the point where we're at now, so that y'all can kind of understand where this questionnaire is coming from. So kind of initially what happened is we were approached by an FBI agent, ARBEST was, and asked, what can we do to help? Can we help get these kids treatment? Can we help do things with these kids? And so initially we said, of course, we're like, yes, absolutely, let's do something. Me in particular, I was an outpatient therapist at the time, and was like, yes, absolutely, bring them to my clinic. I'll be happy to work with them and do trauma-based therapy, but we ran into several barriers to even being able to get them through our door. And so we had to take a bunch of steps back and just start from the beginning, where we wanted to be able to recognize the problem. So what is the problem in Arkansas? What's going on? Where are these kids? Who are these kids? So we wanted to be able to identify them, to find them. And then that led us to collaborating with the CACs throughout the state of Arkansas to even just begin an identification process, a screening process, to see if we can find kids who were at risk for CSEC. So we had to start there. So what we did was we went to the literature to see, okay, what are some screening tools, or what are some questionnaires or surveys or methods that people are using to screen for risk, or screen for if a kid has actually experienced exploitation. And there are some out there, and I'm happy to help y'all find those if you're interested, but for the most part, they were very lengthy questionnaires. They were lengthy interview forms. A lot of them required some finances up front to pay for the measures, or you had to get training from the people who created the measures. And so these were things that, again, kind of caused barriers for us, because we didn't necessarily have the funds to do all of that, the time to do all of that, the people to do the trainings, all that kind of stuff. So that led us to wanting to create our own measure. So one of the things that we were actually able to find was an article by Greenbaum and colleagues, where they went into 3 different emergency rooms in Atlanta, Georgia, and they asked kids who presented to the emergency rooms 6 different questions based on some of those risk factors that I talked about before. So any exposure to, or any drug use, any running away from home, any involvement with law enforcement. So those few different questions they asked, and they found that kids who answered yes to 2 or more of those 6 questions were 22 times more likely to have experienced sexual exploitation. So we decided that, okay, 6 questions, we can do that. We can have advocates fill out a questionnaire based on these 6 questions. That doesn't take a whole lot of time. It should be able to fit into their already ongoing assessment battery with kids. So we took that and kind of created our own online kind of measure. So right here on this slide, I've got the 6 different questions that we pulled from the articles that we found. So Greenbaum and colleagues did this study in a couple of different settings, and they have a couple different publications out on it. So we felt it was at least somewhat researched and evidence-based, so we wanted to be able to kind of replicate that and use that. So we started working with the CACs in November of 2016, and we kind of put together a pilot project where we had the CACs fill out this measure that we created on every kid that or every adolescent that they saw, so kids 12 to 18, over a 6-month period, and we had them enter these questions online so that we could collect this data and kind of understand these kids that are filling out these questions, and seeing if we were able to capture kids who are at risk in Arkansas. So this is what the original version of the questionnaire looked like. There are some more questions that we added to this that were based on literature. So just different things like if the youth had any tattoos or branding, or if they experienced sexual abuse, or just different stuff like that, that we also, if they had a mental health diagnosis. So this doesn't show the entire questionnaire, but this shows at least the first 6 questions that we had. We also had a question on here that we kind of considered a catch-all question, where we just asked the advocate, do you know or suspect that the youth has been trafficked? So that we can kind of get an idea of how many youth actually had experienced trafficking. So this is what we have now. So over the past couple of years, we've continued to have advocates complete this questionnaire, and this data here just shows the kids that were at risk. So we've identified, over the past couple of years, we've identified over 600 kids that are at risk for commercial sexual exploitation within Arkansas. Again, this doesn't confirm that they have been, but they're at least vulnerable and they're at least at risk that we know of. When looking at this chart, a couple things stand out to me. So the blue bars are if the kid answered no, or if the advocate answered no to this question. So this is actually a questionnaire that the advocate completes after their visit with the youth. So the advocate kind of bases their knowledge and answers these questions on that. So the blue bar is no, so they answered no to that question, and the red bar is yes, so they answered yes to the question. And a couple of things that stand out for me, The main ones that they're answering yes to for the most part were some kind of drug use, drug or alcohol use, running away from home. The majority of them answer that, or more answered yes than no, and then involvement with law enforcement was also a big one for them. So those are some of the more salient risk factors that we were noticing. Some of the others that didn't pop as much but still did, so physical injuries, sexually transmitted infections, and having sexual partners wasn't quite as high as the other ones, but they were still there. And then on here we have the 7th question, which was the one where we asked the advocates, do you suspect that the youth had been exploited? And about half of the advocates said yes to about half, for half of the kids, which I thought was interesting. So unfortunately, we didn't get at like, why do they think that and that kind of stuff. So that leads us into the adaptations that we wanted to make with this new version of our screening questionnaire. So we really wanted to be able to make this user-friendly for a variety of settings, something that's quick and easy that y'all can add to your already established assessment batteries, that is a way for you and your organization to continue or to begin identifying kids at risk. So we were hoping that this would begin to not only fit into child advocacy centers, but medical departments, emergency rooms, with law enforcement, juvenile detention centers, mental health patients, so doing it in outpatient or residential, advocacy groups and shelters, which we know are being established all across Arkansas, and basically any facility that's hoping to begin screening for kids who might be at risk is what we're developing this measure for and what we hope will be able to be used. So next steps from that. So we updated our questionnaire based on feedback from our first project, and then we asked the Child Advocacy Center in Springdale to complete our updated questionnaire. And so this is information from that updated questionnaire. So they completed this on youth over a 6-month period. And I'll talk about the adaptations here in a minute, but one of the big ones was that instead of just having the advocate version of the questionnaire, we separated it into 2. So we have an advocate version of the questionnaire and we have a youth version of the questionnaire. And we did that because sometimes it was better or easier for the advocates to complete the questionnaire themselves after their visit with the youth, but sometimes it was better to actually just hand the questionnaire to the youth and have the youth fill it out on themselves. But our previous version wasn't quite user-friendly for adolescents, so one of the things that we did was adapt that. And so some of that information is presented here, but for the most part with this, over these 6 months, the average age of kids that was screened was 14 and a half. We had about 22 males and 79 females that were screened. And then this bottom chart shows the first line is just the measures that the advocate completed on the youth after their visit with the advocate. So they completed about 66 measures. Of that 66 measures, 20% were identified as high risk. So that was about 30% of what the advocates screened for. But the youth, so the next line is the youth who actually filled the measure out on themselves. So they had about 35 youth fill out the measure on themselves, and 17 of those youth identified themselves as high risk based on their answers. So that was about 50% of the youth who filled it out did. So overall, we were able to screen 101 kids, and 37 of those were identified as high risk. So about 30% of those 101 kids. So that's kind of where we were at with this questionnaire. So we were actually able to learn a few lessons from these varying projects that are going into this new version of the questionnaire that we're going to be sharing with everybody. So one of those that I already mentioned was just options for gathering information. So when we originally had the advocates complete the questionnaire just themselves, one of the things that they came back with was, well, it would be nice if we could have the youth fill this out at some point in time, because some youth would be capable of doing that, whereas we still want the advocate version in case that fit better. So we figured for different settings, some settings it might work best if you can just hand the questionnaire to the youth along with other assessments that you might be doing. Some settings it might be better if the advocate or the provider, whoever that might be, is able to just fill it out based on information that you've gotten from a visit with the youth, from the parents, from medical records, and that kind of thing. So we wanted to have a couple of different versions and a couple of different methods to be able to do this with. So then that kind of leads into the manner in which the questionnaire is completed. So again, we want people to be able to have that choice of how they're doing this. Also, the questionnaire is set up as more of, the provider questionnaire is set up as more of kind of a guideline of what type of information to gather. It's not an interview questionnaire. So that's one point that I do want to put across there, is that it's not meant to be sat down with the youth and you just ask the youth the question based exactly as it's written on the questionnaire. It's more speaking to the advocate saying, or speaking to the provider saying, you know, find out information if the youth has had any experience with drug use or alcohol use. Find out if the youth has had any involvement with law enforcement. Find out if the youth has ever run away from home or left home for even just a few hours with the intent of running away, or just different stuff like that. So it really is more of a guideline of what kind of information to gather versus an actual sit-down interview the youth. And the advocates felt like that was a better option for them with how that works within their facility. So part of that too then was wording of the questions. So we really did try to adapt the youth questionnaire to make it user-friendly for the youth, to make it so it doesn't, because you're asking some pretty sensitive questions, so we wanted to make it as non-threatening as possible. One of the things that we did find out, so the youth questionnaire actually has 13 questions on it, whereas the provider has 12 questions. The youth questionnaire, that extra question, that 13th question, asks the youth their comfort level for filling out the questionnaire. So do they feel completely comfortable, somewhat comfortable, neutral, or uncomfortable? And the majority of the youth in our current project said that they felt neutral about it or they were comfortable with it. Most of the youth were not put off by the questions or felt uncomfortable with the questions. So that was a good sign that we feel like the wording, that we have it pretty well. And we updated the wording on the provider questionnaire as well to make it a little bit more user-friendly, to help guide the provider a little bit more as far as the information to gather. We also created an easy access website for y'all to use. So our hope is that being provided with a link to this website, you'll be able to go in and enter the information that's been filled out. The website will score the measure for you, and at the end we'll let you know if the youth has been identified as risk or not, or high risk or not, and provide you with some more information possibly if they have. And so we wanted a way to, one, track the data so that we could have that, because that's important to know moving forward, but also having a way for your organizations to be able to easily use the measure and score the measure. So now, okay, good, we're doing all right with time. Now I'm going to actually talk through what this is going to look like. So if your organization, your agency is thinking about using this measure, wanting to use this measure, would like to partner with ARBEST in this process, I'm going to go through what that will look like for y'all. Basically, what we're doing at this stage in the game, we're not quite ready to make it publicly available yet, just because we're still evaluating the measure and making sure it's actually doing what we think it's doing. And so because of that, we can't just give it to everybody and have it be public quite yet. Our ultimate goal at some point in time is to make it where it is easily accessible to pretty much anybody, but we still have to do a little bit more with the evaluation process. And so that's where your organizations will come in and hopefully help us with that. So this information here is included in a cover letter that you guys will be provided with after this presentation. The cover letter explains all of the steps and information that we're hoping will help you decide as an organization if you want to use this measure or not. And so part of that, we ask that you as an organization, you will use this tool that's provided by us after obtaining permission. So part of that too is you're going to get a really brief survey after this to let us know if you guys are interested in using this tool, and then I will be in contact with you about that process and getting you the tool, getting you the website link and all that kind of stuff. And so as part of that, then we also ask that you will enter the information that you gather from these youth onto that website so that we can continue to evaluate this measure and develop it and make it what we hope we want it to be. So in return, we're going to be, providing y'all with both questionnaires that you will be allowed to use in your agency at no cost. We're going to provide you with the website that you'll be entering this information in. It's going to be de-identified information, so we're not actually connecting the youth's name to a number or anything. All we're asking for is age of the youth, so not even birthday or anything. We're just asking for how many years old they are, what gender they are, race and ethnicity, what organization used the measure. This way it will link to your specific organization and we'll be able to give you data back. And some organizations that might be, you may not need that, but other organizations will find it helpful for like applying for grants and things of that nature. So we want to be able to help provide you with that information. And also part of this is people in your organization will be eligible to be on our CSEC resource call that we host every month. And so that's something too in the survey. If you're interested in being a part of that, you can express interest, and I'll be in contact with you about that information as well and how to be a part of that resource call. Basically what it is we try to have a, it's kind of like this go-to meeting thing, but everybody's able to talk on it. And so providers can be in any part of the state of Arkansas and call into this number or with their computer come on in, and we all just kind of have a conversation about the resources that are going on in the state at the time, what different organizations are doing and providing and connecting people with different resources and networking and that kind of stuff, and supporting, because this is definitely a challenging population to work with at times, and we want to help provide some of that self-care so that you have a place to go for support. So if you're interested in that call as well, you can show that on the survey that gets handed out or passed out to you at the end of the webinar, and I'll be in contact with you. But that's kind of what we're looking for the organizations as far as completing this questionnaire. So now I'm going to show you what they look like. I don't have the entire questionnaire screenshots on here just again because it's not quite public yet, but I wanted to give you just a little bit of a sample of what it looks like. So this is the youth questionnaire. Again, this is to be used with youth ages 12 to 18, and so is the provider questionnaire. We do know that kids under the age of 12 obviously are also trafficked or are at risk, but their risk factors look a little bit different than adolescents. And so we don't have a measure yet for the younger kids. I think that's probably one of the next steps that we're going to be taking. But right now, these questionnaires are just to be used with kids 12 to 18. So again, this is a youth version. We kind of have a disclaimer at the top for the youth. So it's good to either sit down with them and go over the disclaimer with them or make sure that they read it so that they know the reason we're gathering this information is to help us better serve them. They don't have to answer these questions, so there's no pressure to do so. They can always opt out. I always give kids that option. And also, just depending on what information they provide, you may or may not have to share some of that information. So that's dependent on your profession, your organizations. You know, I encourage you to follow your mandated reporting rules for your organization. If there's something the youth does disclose that is reportable, follow your guidelines from your organization about that. But we have something in here that kind of tells the youth that sometimes it might be shared, but best to your ability, you're going to keep their information confidential. And so we have a couple of the questions examples on here, and just kind of the wording. We tried to make it as soft as possible, but also getting to the point as quick as possible. And from the work so far with the child advocacy centers, we feel like the wording of the questions are pretty well done. We actually partnered with Greenbaum, who did that original study that I talked about. We've partnered with her to update this questionnaire and to work on the wording of the questions and that kind of stuff. So we have sought out some more information from her and from the research to make this as user-friendly as possible and as evidence-based as possible. So the youth are just asked 12 questions, yes or no, and they mimic the ones that the providers have. And then there's that 13th question that asks about their comfort level, just because it's good to know if they do feel comfortable with these questions or not. So then this is the provider version, as you can see. So number 1 on the youth asked about drug use. Number 1 on the provider version asks about drug use, and so on and so forth. So all the questions mirror each other. Again, this is really provided for you guys, just whatever is best for your agencies. I know some of the CACs had said, oh, it's much easier if we can just fill out the measure ourselves after we meet with the youth. Whereas others said, it was much easier if we could just hand it to the youth and be in the room with the youth, or, be around for them to ask questions if they had any. I think sometimes it was easier for advocates to do this with older adolescents. So maybe the 16, 17-year-olds, they might hand the measure, versus like the 12, 13-year-olds, they might fill out the information themselves. So really we want this to be as flexible as possible so that it fits with what your organization needs. Because if it's not going to fit with what you need, then we need to revamp or redo or find a better way. Okay, so now the website. So when we give you the link to the website, when you click on that link, it's going to take you to a web page that looks like this. This is the kind of intro web that you'll see. It gives just a little bit more information on the provider and the youth versions, and kind of how to determine which one you might want to use. But then underneath the blue lettering here, there's a box for provider and a box for youth. You'll click on that one just depending on which measure you filled out or which measure was completed. And then once you click on that, it will take you to a demographics page where it will ask you just the demographics that I had gone over earlier about the youth's race, ethnicity, gender, all that kind of stuff, age. And then it will also ask you for your organization specifically. So we'll try to have every organization's title on here so that we can connect your data to your organization and be able to provide you with that information later down the road. We have the state that the youth resides in as well. This is because I've had a couple of organizations that are interested in using the measure, but they actually take kids from out of state sometimes. And so we want to try to track some of the data of, is the kid actually a resident of Arkansas, or are they coming from other states into our state for services and that kind of thing. But if they are in Arkansas, we also ask you to identify your county, just again, so we can kind of keep track of information that's going throughout our state. And that's going to help later down the line when applying for grants, when people are wanting to know more about what our state looks like as far as trafficking goes, we can provide them with that information. So right now I just have the screenshot, but if you scroll down on the same page is where the questionnaire, the questions are from the questionnaire. And so you'll just click yes, no, unknown on the provider one, or yes, no for the youth one, just depending on which one was filled out. And this shouldn't take more than just a couple of minutes to do for each questionnaire. So that was the other thing, is we wanted to make, one, the questionnaires quick and easy to fill out, but two, the website to be quick and easy so that it's not taking up too much more of your time. So once you fill in all the questionnaire information, you're going to see a screen kind of like the one on the left here. So it kind of takes you back to the original screen where you'll choose provider or youth if you have another measure to fill out. But what it also does is scores the measure and lets you know if the youth is high risk or not. So on the right side, I've got the 3 different options that might pop up. So kind of the yellowy gold option is an undetermined option. So what that means is, from the provider version, there's too many unknowns marked, and so we couldn't effectively score the measure because of that. Now, I don't want that to discourage anybody for putting unknown, because if you are unsure whether or not the kid has used drugs or whether or not law enforcement was involved or that kind of stuff, it's better to put unknown versus no, because it's a little bit more accurate. And that might be a flag to you that says, okay, well, we have too many unknowns. Maybe I should go back with the youth and talk with them a little bit more, gather a little bit more information so we have a better understanding of what's going on. The other options that might come up, so the green one is if a kid did not screen for high risk for trafficking. And then the red one is if they did screen as high risk for trafficking. If they did screen as high risk, we've also included a link that will connect you to a 2-page handout that's kind of a brief report on what could you do next. So what are some other steps you could take if a kid did screen as high risk? Because we don't just want to screen for high risk, we also actually want to be able to help these kids. And so what does that mean if they did screen for high risk? What does that look like? So we have a link there that you can go to, and we'll continue to update this resource as we go, as we learn more information. And also, this is going to depend on the organization. So if the organization is a shelter, then finding a shelter may not necessarily need to be a resource that you find. You might need other different resources, but if this is, say, a child advocacy center, they might need that resource for a shelter or something else. So each organization is going to have different needs for resources. So we're going to continue to update this, but also I'm happy to work with each organization to kind of figure out what their specific needs are if a youth does screen as high risk. This is just a little snapshot of a little bit of that resource page and what that looks like. Basically, we go through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If y'all have heard of that, it's basically like kind of bottom of the pyramid is making sure the kids' basic needs are being met, and then you work your way up. Are they, so do they have food, clothing, shelter? Work your way up. Are they safe where they're at? Work your way up. Do they need mental health services? Work your way up. Do they need other services like drug rehabilitation or different things of that nature? And so that's kind of what the resources are looking at for that. So. Okay, so important things to remember. I kind of put this here at the very end just so I could remind myself of the kind of key points I wanted to make sure everybody knew before they start using this measure. So again, your organization will be provided with both versions of the questionnaire. It will be up to you guys to decide if you want to just use the youth version as part of your already established assessment battery, if you want to use only the provider version, because that's just easier for you guys to fill that out after obtaining information from the youth or family or whatever, or if you want to use one or the other. So maybe you want to do it on an independent basis. So maybe one kid comes in and you feel like, okay, they should fill out the youth version versus another kid who comes in, maybe it's better to do the provider version. That's going to be up to you guys to decide. We do ask that you only use one of the versions with each child for a couple of different reasons. So, say Sally comes into your office or whatever and completes the youth version, and then you also complete the provider version on her, and then you enter both of those into the website. That Sally is then being counted as two kids in our website. And so as far as data purposes, it makes things a little bit more challenging and murky to figure out what the more exact number is of kids being identified as high risk. But also what we've learned from advocates is filling out both measures doesn't necessarily add a whole lot. It just takes up a little bit more time and that kind of stuff. So using one or the other has been sufficient. And make sure you're using this with kids 12 to 18. As I mentioned before, yes, we know kids under 12 are also being trafficked and are at risk, but right now we just don't have what we feel is a good valid measure to use for that. But that's something that's in our to-do list to kind of work through. We ask that you not share the measure with any other organizations, just again because it's not public yet. Eventually we're going to make it public and allow everyone to use it, but right now it's still in its development phase, and so we need to kind of keep a tight grip on it for now. But if you know of other organizations or other people who do want to use it, just have them contact me and I'm happy to talk through that with them and make sure it is something appropriate for their organization and kind of how best it would fit into their organization. So we don't want to be stingy with it. We just want to make sure that it's being used appropriately and whatnot before we're able to get it out publicly. Also, it's important to complete paper copies. So I didn't mention this earlier, but so I know a lot of organizations are getting to the point where they have their assessment measures on a tablet. And so the kid can just go through on the tablet and then it just automatically uploads into your medical records and all that kind of stuff. We ask that you do a paper copy, at least with the youth, because, and I'm going to go back here a little bit if I can, because again, remember when you finish the questionnaire, this screen pops up that says whether or not the kid is at risk for CSEC or not. And you may not be ready to have that conversation with the youth. I do encourage you to have a conversation with the youth at some point about their potential risk factor and maybe do some psychoeducation about vulnerability and safety and that kind of stuff. But you may not want to do that immediately as the screen pops up. And so just as a method to protect them, it's better for them to fill out a paper copy of the version and then you go in and fill out on the website later, if that makes sense, hopefully. We are asking to, so several people from one organization are welcome to use the measure, but it would be helpful for us if we could have a point person for each organization so that we're only communicating with one person and not multiple people, so that you're getting all the right information and we're getting all the right information, so that we are able to communicate back and forth, to give the measures to give updated measures as they come out, to give data and that kind of stuff. If anybody has questions, they can kind of go through that person. So if you have multiple people in your organization that's thinking about using this, go ahead and talk with each other and kind of see who you may want a point person to be for us to communicate with. And lastly, and very importantly, is that this is a screening questionnaire. It's not a diagnostic questionnaire. So it does not confirm that a youth has been exploited. It only screens for whether or not they are at risk and whether or not they're vulnerable. So that's important to note. There are, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of questionnaires out there, interviews and that kind of stuff that get more at diagnosing, or not necessarily diagnosing, but looking specifically at if and confirming, I guess is a better word, if the youth has been exploited. And I'm happy to point you in the direction of those questionnaires if that's something you're interested in. But this one is specifically a screening questionnaire. And so if the youth is screened as high risk, you may want to do a more thorough assessment or a more thorough interview or something to weed out some of those questions or to weed out some of that information that might be important for you to know. So just as you know that it's just a screener, we're not actually confirming CSEC. I will say there is one question on the questionnaire that does kind of talk about basically the definition of CSEC. And so even if that question is answered yes, it still may not 100% confirm, but we have a better idea if it might be that. So the question, I can't remember exactly how it reads, but it's basically, has the youth exchanged a sexual act for something of value, such as money or food or shelter or that kind of stuff. So it really does get at the heart of what CSEC is. But again, it's still not confirming. We don't know for sure for that. But that also reminded me of one other thing I do want to mention is also make sure you're screening. If you use a screening questionnaire, we do ask that you use it for all of the kids that come into your organization, and that you're not just using it for kids who you think might be at risk, because if you do that, then you're already doing your own kind of screening process. But also if you know a youth has been exploited, like if you're in the juvenile detention centers and you know for a fact that this child was picked up due to sexual exploitation, we still ask that you complete the measure, because that also helps us know specific risk factors tied to those specific kids. So we hope that you'll use this for just any kid that comes into your organization. Okay, I think that's maybe all the information that I had. I'm trying to remember if there's anything I forgot, but that was about the gist. Do we have questions?
All right, thanks, Dr. Brandt. So yeah, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to type that in. One question that we did have that was kind of asked towards the beginning, we should kind of speak about self-harm or self-interest behaviors. Is that a question that's asked on this updated version, or just kind of maybe talk about that as like a risk factor?
That is a good question that I honestly don't know a whole lot about. So that is not something that's captured on the questionnaire, but that is something that, and not something that has necessarily come up as a direct risk factor that I have seen in the literature. I can imagine that, yes, it probably does play a role because mental health in children, so depression, anxiety, that kind of stuff can play a risk factor. And we know that self-harm, suicidal ideations, that kind of stuff is a significant symptom of depression. So there might be an indirect link between all of that, but this screening questionnaire does not specifically ask for that.
All right, great. Another individual asks, you'd mentioned earlier working with some of these youth. Can you talk about that process and how that maybe looks different working with trafficked youth who then, say, your other youth that you work with do TFCBT with or traditional therapy? Like, how does that look, or kind of share your experiences with that?
Great question. So yes, it does look different. Actually, so TFCBT still is the gold standard treatment for kids who have been exploited, but there's been some research out there as of late that talks about how to adapt TFCBT for exploited youth. And actually on the resource page that will pop up for you on the website, if the kid has screened for high risk, I actually have citations for articles and books that talk about how to adapt TFCBT. Some of what that looks like is, and for those of you who don't know what TFCBT is, so trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, it's the gold standard treatment for kids who have experienced trauma of any kind, including CSEC. And so a big part of TFCBT is going through these different components to help the youth learn how to learn some coping skills, some relaxation skills, learn different ways of thinking. So what we call cognitive coping, they go through a process where they actually talk about their trauma and process their trauma. And then there's other pieces where we do enhancing safety, psychoeducation, parenting, all that kind of stuff. So with CSEC youth, a lot of that is adapted or adjusted. So you still do all those components, but it looks more of like what you would do with a complex trauma case. And so you do a lot more of that upfront work. So you do a lot more of that relaxation training, a lot more of that cognitive coping. You do, oftentimes initially you'll start with safety. So working on safety stuff for them, especially with running away, that's a big thing for these kids. And so working on what that even looks like. Sometimes you have to adapt your policies even, because if you have a kid who is an elopement risk, who does run away quite a bit, they might miss sessions with you, and they might miss multiple sessions with you, where for one client you might have to discharge them, but for this one it's part of their presenting concern, so you may have to be flexible with that if possible. So there's a bunch of different things, and actually part of that too is enhancing safety for other concerns of for like drug use. That actually does go in and talk about self-harm and suicidal ideation, so just all that kind of stuff that you would want to make sure that you're doing. Parenting practices are going to need to be talked about up front, so helping parents better understand and address issues as they come up with these youth, if they are, you know, within their home, which some of them are, some of them aren't. So treatment for these youth definitely looks a little bit different than what it would for a normal trauma case, but I do have links to that information when that high-risk stuff comes up.
Thanks. We got a couple more questions that came in. So for the bulk of this presentation, Dr. Brandt, we've been talking about organizations using it, and one person typed in, is this good for foster parents or maybe other individuals who are listening on the call? What's sort of your thoughts on that? Individuals or foster parents, is this a helpful tool for them?
Really good question. Right now, we have it just to where it is with organizations. We haven't really thought through what this might look like just for a foster parent. One of the things the foster parent could do, though, is work with the child's provider, so whether it be psychiatrist, pediatrician, mental health provider, whatever, to talk about these different risk factors. And so even though you may not specifically have the questionnaire, you can understand the risk factors and the red flags and think through that kind of stuff. But it's not something that we've developed specifically for foster families or adoptive families or things of that nature. Maybe like a case manager could potentially. So right now it is really for agencies and facilities and organizations, but that's something that we can think through, again, of kind of next steps moving forward, what that might look like for foster parents and that kind of thing.
Okay. Another individual asked, after completing the questionnaire and assessment, have you found that the child's hypervigilance to trauma is heightened? And if so, recommendations for supporting that child?
To my knowledge, no, their hypervigilance hasn't been elevated or anything like that. My understanding from the CACs that have done this work so far, they've been able to, you know, when filling out this questionnaire, I would recommend that you be in the same room with the youth, be able to provide support to the youth if they need it. My understanding is that hasn't needed to be the case as of yet. But it's definitely, there are some questions on there that might trigger a youth. And so having the provider in the room with the youth, being able to provide supports afterwards if needed, and what that looks like might be different for each kid. It might just be that they need a little bit of support. They might need to talk to someone for a few minutes, and that kind of thing. So just kind of monitor how the kid's responding, how the kid's reacting, but it's similar to other types of trauma assessment as you would do if any of y'all have like used the CATS or the UCLA or that kind of stuff. It's a similar process as of that. So just being aware, but to my knowledge, it hasn't really caused youth any significant concerns.
We'll get one other question here out of the way, and then we'll kind of advance to the CU slide. Is the youth version available in Spanish? And the second part of that question, does the tool ask about immigration or family separation? I think I know the answers to both of those questions, but I'll let Dr. Brandt reply to those.
I wish I could say yes to both of those questions, but unfortunately I cannot. Not yet anyways. So just as measures are being developed right now, we're lucky to even have one that's in English. But again, next steps, what we're looking at, yes, absolutely, we would love to make the measure available in multiple languages. So as we're moving through our next steps, moving through advancements, moving through development of the questionnaire, we absolutely are hoping to get to that stage. And it does not currently ask about immigration or separation or anything like that either, but we do know, again, that that is actually a big factor for these kids. So that's something that's on our radar when we do a little bit more development. Unfortunately, there are probably 50 to 60 to 100 to who knows how many risk factors that we could put on the questionnaire that are important, and I don't want to disregard any of them. It's just that when we do that, it makes the questionnaire much more lengthy and much more time consuming to fill out. Again, other questionnaires that are already developed do take all of that into consideration. And so if those, again, are ones that you're interested in, I'm happy to point you in the right direction if you want to email me. But for this purpose, to make it that kind of quick 5-minute screener that someone can use, we just couldn't include every single question. We could only include those that we know are kind of the highest links right now. Even though there are a bunch of links, we just included those that we know are the highest. But there are other questionnaires that do take that into consideration.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brandt. So I'll just briefly talk here about the CEU for those of you who are interested in that, and we can still got a little bit of time. We can stick around to answer any remaining questions. So the code that for today's webinar is 0905. So write that down, put it on a piece of paper right now, and I will send a survey link out to you immediately following this webinar, and then you'll be asked to enter that code, and it's going to be good for 5 days. So just when you can, kind of get that code entered. Again, after this webinar is done, I'll send you a survey for that. And the code again is 0905. And yeah, we'll just take last call for questions. I'll leave the CU slide up here in case folks need time to write that down. I just wanted to thank Dr. Brandt for sort of being tenacious and getting this project, really shepherding this project through for the past couple of years. And it's exciting that we're sort of at a point now and really learning more about this population. So thank you for taking the time and sharing and helping us learn more about this problem. So thank you. So last questions, we'll hang out here for about 30 seconds or so and get out of here a little early. So feel free to type those in, or most of you should have my email or Dr. Brandt's email that was displayed. You always feel free to ask us a question afterwards.